let's see. So let me go chronologically. I believe that my first, yeah, I have trouble tracing my experience with Lovecraft because it has, by the time I experienced it, it had seeped very deeply into the pop culture canon, into just our experience as gamers and as nerds.
Right.
Even further today, but yeah, back in the mid '90s, I remember getting the 5th edition of the Call of Cthulhu role playing game as a prize at a gaming convention that I went to.
Wow, a 5th edition. Okay.
Yeah, and it's currently in its 7th. Currently in its 7th edition. Our mutual friend Chad and I had just finished a Doctor Who role-playing game that we enjoyed, and so they offered me this, open up this box and pick out a free role-playing game to take home. And I, unlike you, am attracted by creepy, gelatinous, tentacled monsters with glowing eyes that look like they're going to eat you or drive you insane. And so I picked up this book and thought, this is great. And what I discovered when I opened it was a different style of role-playing game than I had heard of. I had become not familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, which of course I was not allowed to play at all, but because of my religious upbringing.
See, now this is fascinating to me. That in your upbringing, like we're totally okay with Star Trek, and we're okay with.
Well, no, but go ahead.
Oh no.
Oh well, no. Let's go back to Star Trek. If you want to talk about the religious upbringing, there were at least 2 periods of my childhood where my dad could not tolerate the liberal humanitarian themes of Star Trek, so we had to take a break from it.
Okay, interesting.
Seasons 2 and 4 of TNG. Like I said, there were 2 breaks, and then he finally kind of shrugged his shoulders and said whatever around season 5. We got back into it.
Wow. Okay.
No, Star Trek has always been questionable, but at least there's no magic. That was pretty much my parents' line.
It's the magic.
As long as there's no sorcery. It's the magic, right?
Yeah.
And so you were going to ask about them being cool with Call of Cthulhu? Is that where you were going with that?
Well, yeah, I was kind of about to get there, yeah.
Because that's definitely not the case. Of course, they let me read, C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't let me read Lord of the Rings.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
See, now
were,
this is... This is really interesting to me because I feel like that at least, whatever we might think of how, whatever we might think about that standard, at least that seems to be a little bit more consistent than the positions of a lot of Christians that I've heard about, because Tolkien, that's fine because he was a Catholic and there's a lot of imagery, Christian symbolism in the Lord of the Rings, and so we're okay with that. But that was not kosher.
No, it was not. It was by the time I was in high school. They softened on a lot of things.
Yeah,
I think through a combination of their own growth, and I'm not judging that one way or another, but that was probably also combined with the fact that they knew that they just couldn't keep me from everything forever.
Right.
So when I brought home this gelatinous tentacle-covered 5th edition of Call of Cthulhu, my dad definitely picked it up and said, all right, this looks pretty satanic to me, and that was sort of a through line of a lot of things I was into. I would bring anime home, and he would say, oh, this is of the devil. And I would have to walk him through, there's not actually any pro or con, for or against religious content in this material. And that, to me, means that... And that's... We'll get into this later in the Lovecraft conversation, but his work completely eschews religion altogether. His cosmology is 100% alien.
Yeah.
And mostly unknowable by humans, and that's why it's horrific.
Yeah.
But, yeah, the monsters are scary, and so they're going to rub people the wrong way, and that's just how it is.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about, because I'm familiar with some role-playing games. I am totally unfamiliar with Call of Cthulhu. What is that game system like?
The game system is based on Rollmaster, but see, I'm referencing things that are far before my time that I don't have experience with. It came out in the early 80s from a company called Chaosium. A guy named Sandy Peterson decided that there was more to this tabletop role-playing thing than just dungeon delves and killing orcs and leveling up. And so when I picked up this 5th edition, I realized, there is this whole other enterprise possible in role-playing games, which centers around investigation, and it centers around the game master coming up with a loose narrative that may occur, that may or may not occur during the story, and then allowing the players to discover clues to this narrative and interacting with it in that way. There is almost no combat in Call of Cthulhu, although it contains plenty of rolls for combat and hit points and weapon damages and stuff. But when your weapon does an average of 6 points of damage, and the creatures that you are encountering have hundreds of points of damage and many, many attacks per round more than you, there's really not going to be that much combat occurring. The combat that exists in Call of Cthulhu, I'm going to be honest, it's a bit of a vestigial thing from, again, Rollmaster and other fantasy role-playing games. They included it because they felt they had to.
Right.
Because of course people are going to want to take machine guns and attack these eldritch deities that are the size of tall buildings.
Right.
And they do on a regular basis. Like, that's just a trope of the genre. Like, the investigators don't know what else to do, so shoot a machine gun at it until you die.
Until you die. Yeah. Right.
Until you die. Yes, until the character dies. Not you as the player, of course, but the
well, no, of course not.
Playing. So that's what it's like. It's not my favorite system, and I've just described why that is. I'm a bit more of a rules-light, loosey-goosey story game kind of guy who just gets into the story more than the mechanics, but what I was trying to describe was a role-playing game that came out to introduce a different style of play than any other role-playing game had. And to this day, I think it is the one, just the one role-playing game that every other role-playing game has to grapple with if it wants to be a story-driven game. If your game focuses on combat and tactics, you're going to reference Dungeons and Dragons at some point. But if your role-playing game centers around story, or especially investigation and mystery, you're going to have to reference Call of Cthulhu.
Okay, so now let's talk about your proclivities then towards the story-driven role-playing game. Would you like to talk about the Fate system and the game that you were developing?
I can. I am not. Okay, let me say that for myself, role-playing games and my musical outlets occupy a similar mental space. And what that means is, depending on what day you're talking to me, role-playing games may be the most important thing on my mind, or they may be the least important thing on my mind, based on whether or not I am currently having time in my life to pursue music and songwriting and performances and recording. So
okay, so gaming and music is kind of a zero-sum game in your head, basically?
Exactly. One or the other. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I've taken breaks from gaming for no other reason than I get utterly burnt out and bored from it.
Sure.
And then I inevitably find myself in a musical place because my creative energy must go to one of the two areas. So when you ask me whether I would like to describe a game that I'm working on, I'm not working on a game currently.
Right.
I'm happy to talk about my experiences and my opinions and whatnot, but I'm in a musical space right now, so
okay.
That's harder for me.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And honestly, if you're not interested in talking about that at the moment, then that's perfectly fine as well.
I'm more than interested. I've actually I don't have an outline in front of me or anything, but I've been going over some ideas today about what we could talk about in this geek realm, so I'm all about it.
Yeah. So and I may have mentioned this to you before, but up until at least very recently, and it may still be around somewhere, I still have, or at least again until very recently, had held on to that piece of art for Hands and Faces.
Oh yeah, very cool. Yeah, I've got that hanging up in my. Oh no, I took it down from the old place and it's not hanging up anymore. But yeah, I've commissioned a couple pieces of art in my life, and that one I was the most happy with. I was working at flippin' Tim Hortons of all places, and one of my coworkers, I found out. Right, so you don't expect to meet people in any kind of field when you're working at a place like that, any field whatsoever. But one of my managers was a fantasy artist, and I thought, oh, okay, what do you mean by fantasy artist? Oh, I've actually worked on Magic the Gathering. Tell me more.
Oh, wow. I never knew that he had actually worked on Magic.
Mm-hmm. And he was currently, at the time, and Lord, this is 13 years ago now, but he was working on a project that I believe was abandoned, but at the time it was a Warhammer MMO that was going to come out.
Oh, okay.
but they were like 2 years deep in the development of this Warhammer online RPG that he was doing some art direction for. And
That's awesome.
I saw some of his stuff, and I was completely blown away by his stuff. And I knew that there was no way I could afford him, but he said, like, hey, yeah, I'll just, do the whole thing that you're never supposed to do, which is provide art for exposure.
Right.
And I said, are you sure? And he said, yeah, let me just, do this for fun because I've never done a role-playing game before. And yeah, he created this super evocative piece of art based around I guess I would have to call that game urban fantasy in the sense that it involves, it's set in the present day, and it involves demons and monsters kind of entering our world and what our own spiritual abilities are in that context. And that's kind of all I have to say about that, because I don't know, I abandoned the system and I abandoned a lot of ideas I had about role-playing games at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just not on my radar.
Okay. Well, I definitely look back fondly on those RPG sessions, because I think that was a lot of fun. Not because my character necessarily had a lot of interesting things to do. In fact, I think that I was definitely one of the casualties in terms of sanity when it came to that game.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, that was fun.
They were good sessions for sure.
Yeah. Let's see. So now I'm.
So you asked a moment ago about my proclivities towards story games versus role playing games.
Yeah,
I can talk about that a little bit.
Definitely.
Well, I guess after this is I don't think this will get too personal, because I think my feelings about this already. So you and I started hanging out in earnest around 2004 or 5, I believe.
Yeah.
And again, due to our mutual friendship with Chad, and he and you invited me to play my very first D&D sessions. And
oh wow, you had never played D&D before. That's right, I forgot that.
Never ever. I had lurked on a college game at Capital, and at this game at Capital University, there were 2 dungeon masters, and they introduced themselves as hey, my name's Jim or whatever, and my number 1 goal tonight is to kill your character. I just walked out. There was nothing there for me.
Yeah.
And your games had a cool story that you had taken some time to develop and bring my character into, which was super cool.
Yeah, your character was pivotal to that game.
Completely pivotal. Even if I didn't know how to use
cast a spell. Again, I was going to get to that actually, because that was so hilarious.
Yeah. So yeah, I should just start I knew I was a magic user, but I thought I had to save all my spells for a bigger fight, so I just kept firing my crossbow every round. Crossbow, miss. And you guys helped me. You guys were super helpful.
It was bad to the point, I think, actually, that I think you did actually get killed pretty early in one of those sessions, yes. And so we had to go on a whole side quest to earn enough money to buy a resurrection spell for you.
Yes, and through no fault of your own, through the process of purchasing said resurrection spell and getting killed and coming back and realizing that I was pivotal, but I wasn't so rocking the system enough to enjoy it, I realized that D&D wasn't for me.
Yeah.
It's not personal, and I hear 5th edition is great. I would try it if a bunch of friends convinced me, but around 1999 and 2000, I started to learn about these creator-owned RPGs that were being released on the internet for free, and they were about 1 to 10 pages usually of entire rules content, whereas a D&D book or a Call of Cthulhu book averages 200 to 300 pages.
Right.
Just to be perfectly honest, these games were a little more my speed. I can understand these rules. They're 4 pages long.
Yeah.
I can get this to the table tonight. And for me, that's just a manageable experience, right?
Sure.
I can organize 3 or 4 friends. We can have fun for a couple of evenings. They're not quite as much of an investment as your typical D&D campaign. And yeah, they provide very, very focused narrative experiences. They are very specific in genre and tone. For instance, one of my favorite new games is called Night Witches, and it takes place in World War II. And it takes place in a all-female bomber squadron fighting for the Russians, which is a real thing that happened.
Wow.
Aviation was quite a national obsession at the time that the war broke out, and there were a number of superstar female pilots who were